Jim, good morning. On this gray day in Ohio. I come from Reno, Nevada, where it's sunny all the time. No, not really, but I like to think so anyway. My goal today is to talk to you about sustainability in horticulture from a consumer perspective, looking at some of the consumer attitudes and preferences for different container types. We recently conducted a survey of some of our, I would say about 800 of our horticulture extension clients. So people who have come to us for different programs and for assistance and have given us voluntarily their email address so that we could do an internet survey. So what I want to start out by telling you at the outset is that this survey is not representative, okay, of the entire nation. It's really only represents people in Nevada and then people who are really pretty interested in horticulture enough that they would attend our classes and other events. So I want to just preface this at the outset by telling you that. However, I also want to tell you that this is kind of a preliminary survey that was really more information gathering than statistical, and I'm going to approach it from that perspective. Not all consumers are alike, and you probably realize that. Attitudes, preferences, behaviors amongst consumers will differ depending on a lot of different factors, whether or not they buy plants, whether or not they garden. Even green consumers, consumers that are environmentally aware, differ in what they consider sustainable and what they consider green. And so if you try to lump that category together as one big market share, you're going to really be missing out on some opportunities because there are differences even within the green consumers. What we decided to do with this survey, and it's just a simple survey, we didn't do anything real fancy, was to find out what are the bio-renewable plant container characteristics that consumers deem most desirable. In other words, what are the things that they would consider desirable enough that they would purchase that over a conventional petroleum-based pot, or maybe even pay extra for. So that's what we are getting at with our survey. But before I get into the survey that we did, I want to talk a little bit about some of the work that's been done in the recent past, and the work of Hall and others, and then that same group, Behe and others, did some similar types of studies looking at sustainability and environmental issues amongst consumers. And I've patterned our survey after some of their work. In 2010, Hall did some work looking at different kinds of not bioplastic, but different kinds of plant containers and which kinds were more preferable to consumers. They looked at straw and they looked at a variety of other types of containers, and they weren't actually creating these containers, they were just using those as examples of which would you purchase, one or the other. What they found with their survey, well, number one, they found that there was quite a bit of diversity in what people wanted and what they liked, and people had pretty strong feelings about that. But overall, the container type and price was found to be actually less important than the type of plant they were purchasing and where that plant was grown. Okay, so whether it was grown locally, whatever you mean by local, or whether it was grown in your region, or whether it came from international perhaps, so further away. So those were more important actually than container type. And we really found that in our survey as well. The other thing that they found was that concern about environmental issues is really linked to increased interest in low environmental impact products. Well, that makes sense. The people who are environmentally aware and wanting to do things that are more environmentally friendly are going to be interested in these types of products. So that makes a lot of sense, and again, we found that to be the case too. In their study, Behe et al. In 2013, they found that compostable containers were preferred over containers that you could plant in the ground and they would biodegrade. And both of those were preferred over the conventional petroleum-based pot. Our studies showed a little bit of difference in that, but it wasn't statistically significant, so I'm not going to draw any conclusions about that. And then they divided the market into segments based on plant type preferences. In our survey, I tried to do that, and it turns out that there were no differences. Everybody seemed to be willing to purchase just about anything with some restrictions and some things that they would need information on before they would actually make a decision. And so the difference between the work that Hall and Behe did is that they used a conjoint analysis where they were looking at different container attributes and evaluating multiple attributes and basing one over the other. So in other words, they would show a consumer one type of product and another, and the only difference might be one attribute, say price, and which one the consumer chose in that particular set of choices then would tell us how valuable that attribute was. We didn't do that. We just wanted to kind of get an overall view of what people would be willing to purchase and how much more they'd be willing to pay. So our specific objectives in this survey were, number one, to determine consumer preference for container type, to see if there was one type of container based on the words biodegradable, compostable, recyclable, or a pot that fertilizes. Those were the four types that we posed to our respondent base. And then second, to provide a consumer profile for a person who would purchase a biorenewable container. So that's what we did. And we, as I said, surveyed about 800 people who are former or current program participants in some of our horticultural extension programs. We ended up with 215 respondents for about a 27% response rate. And as you'll see, we had a pretty homogeneous, this is a self-selected group, so we didn't tell them they had to take the survey. Of course, with IRB, you have to tell them, you're free to leave this survey at any time. It was an internet-based survey. We used SurveyMonkey, so they didn't even have to complete it if they didn't want to. But we had a lot of them that did complete it, and so it was, I think, quite valuable. But what we found was that 91% of the people who did complete the survey were homeowners, 82% were 45 years of age or older. Many were even over age 60, so we had probably a little bit of a skew towards people who were older. Compare that to the studies by Behe, and their average age was 37.5 years. So they had a younger group of people they were surveying. 72% of ours were female, whereas Behe and Hall, both of their studies were about 50-50 roughly. And 66% of our survey respondents had a bachelor's degree or greater, so they were a very highly educated group, which is a little bit different. So we had kind of a homogeneous group, but I'll show you there were some differences. And the one difference that we found was in household income. And so we really chose, this might be an area where we could tease out some differences in the market. Pretty much over the range of salaries from under $40,000 a year to over $100,000 a year was pretty equally distributed across our respondent base. But I will point out that this area here, the blue area, that's people who preferred not to tell us how much they made in a year, and so that's about 25% of our group wouldn't tell us that. But I will say when I went through that data and looked at that group, they were also homogeneous and they did not differ from the mean of our overall responses and results. So I kind of separated that group and basically looked at people who did respond to what their household income was. And so this is the kind of things that people are purchasing. Nearly half of the respondents in our survey purchase plants 6 or more times a year. So these are people who are really interested in gardening. They're heavy plant purchasers. Most of them were purchasing either flowering annuals, flowering perennials, or vegetable starts, and some herbs. So that was really the biggest group. And then a smaller group were purchasing shrubs, fruit trees, and shade trees. And a very tiny amount, about 2%, did not purchase any plants over the past year. So that's really not very significant. We didn't look at that group at all. As far as gardening and landscaping practices, what I was hoping to be able to do was to see if people who used more sustainable types of practices had different kinds of attitudes and preferences for container type. Again, because our respondent base was fairly homogeneous, I did not find a lot of differences. Most people are, over half are composters. Many use native plants in their landscapes, and many also use water conserving plants. So they have those kinds of sustainable attitudes about landscaping. And so that kind of tells you right off the bat that we're working with a group who's really interested in our project and really interested in what we're doing. So I think that made a difference in some of our results. We also asked them if they use soil amendments. And I should stop here and tell you, in Nevada, our gardeners are pretty much, they've been trained to understand that Nevada soils are challenging, and that's being nice, okay? We've got very geologically young soils, which means they aren't well formed. In a single landscape, you can have soils that are really, really rocky and sandy, and some areas where it's really, really heavy clay, all in the same landscape. And then if you get into the southern part of the state, you get soils that are salty, and you may get areas with a shallow hardpan layer. And so it's really, really difficult. And so we train our people, amend your soil, amend your soil, amend your soil. And people learn that very quickly when they start gardening in Nevada. So it's no surprise that over 90% of our respondent base uses compost on a regular basis. Fewer use peat moss, triple mix. Triple mix is kind of a mix of 3 ingredients, and what the ingredients are varies by manufacturer. Animal manure is heavily used as well. We have a lot of animal agriculture in Nevada, and so we have a lot of manure, and so people use it. And then I was surprised by the number of people who actually use cover crops in their landscapes and in their gardens. That's something that I've been trying to teach people to do, but I didn't realize that so many people were actually starting to do that.